Grace and peace be with you, St. Paul's. Thank you so much. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Kristen McIntyre, our presenter, our retreat master, we could say, for our Lenten mission, our Lenten retreat this year here at St. Paul's. Dr. McIntyre, she's a convert to the faith. That occurred in 1997. All you converts, raise your hands. Converts, raise your hands. See? Look at it, you're in good company right there. There you go. She earned a combined MD PhD degree in pharmacology and toxicology from the University of Kansas Medical Center. She returned to Oregon to complete a residency in psychiatry at OHSU. She's been in outpatient practice as a psychiatrist in the Portland area since 2003. And then she transitioned to telehealth in 2020 and now treats patients remotely in 4 states, having relocated to northern Idaho in 2021. In addition to medication management, psychotherapy continues to be a main focus of her practice. And to better serve a growing number of Catholic patients in recent years, she has pursued training in Thomistic psychology as well as with the John Paul II Healing Center, and has been featured guest on 2 recent episodes of Restore the Glory podcast with Dr. Bob Schutz and Jake Kim. She's kind of blowing up right now, people. People are recognizing how brilliant she is. And she is, in all honesty. She is a very intelligent woman, both in the spiritual life, in her field of expertise, and in the reality of what healing looks like in Jesus Christ. And brothers and sisters, we're going to be beginning this and perhaps ending in darkness tonight. Our new light system blew, but that's okay. We'll be okay, right? And so we are going to be professing a light that pierces through all darkness, and we will not worry if we happen to find ourselves in physical darkness or ambient darkness. Dr. McIntyre is also an oblate of Mount Angel Abbey, and she's offered periodic retreats there as well. But the core of this, she's a woman who I've known for a while and that I'm able to collaborate with in regards to care for people. And I delight in the anointing that God has put on her life. And I delight in how she has so joyfully responded to the glory of God within Catholicism, within her personal walk as a woman, a mother, and a psychiatrist. So I introduce to you Dr. Kristen McIntyre.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is truly a blessing to be here. And it's just so interesting how many things try to complicate an event like this, like the power not working, the lights not working. Just the number of complications I've experienced in the last couple of weeks personally makes me think that something important is going to happen over the next 3 nights. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm really excited for all of us. So over the next 3 nights, I'm going to be talking about healing. Basically, I'm going to be talking about the same thing over 3 nights, but doing it each night from a little different perspective. And each of these perspectives is valuable because it's true. The truth sets us free. And the particular perspective I'm going to talk about this evening is that of St. Thomas Aquinas. So the traditional Catholic understanding of the way we were created as a body-soul composite. Perhaps you might have heard about or even read for yourself some of what St. Thomas had to say about the faculties of the human person. And when I say faculties, really basically what I'm talking about is what we think of modernly as our psychology. What St. Thomas figured out, or what he received from God, really, what he wrote down in the 1200s holds up incredibly well in the face of modern developments in neuroscience, psychological research, even neuroimaging, because it's true, and the objective truth doesn't change. So what was true 800 years ago is still true today. So that'll be tonight. I have a handout for you, which Father Justin is on his way to finish printing and bring back. So we'll get it. In the meantime, some of the things I'm going to be explaining and talking about, it really does help to have a visual. So I'll wave my hands around, and try to I don't know, act it out up here. But if some of what I'm saying is just like flying over your head, just sit tight. You'll get a piece of paper, and it'll be a little more clear. So tomorrow night, I'm going to get into a different perspective. So not the mechanics of our faculties so much, as a more experiential relational point of view, namely that of what's termed inner healing. So this encompasses a variety of things, from psychological therapy and tools like EMDR, which some of you may have heard of, anything from that to types of prayer, including various types of what's called inner healing prayer, such as what Dr. Bob Schutz and the John Paul II Healing Center, what they do. So that's tomorrow night. And then on Wednesday night, I'm going to be talking about the flow of grace, God's grace. Because when we restore ourselves to out-of-the-box condition, according to what St. Thomas teaches, and also to what we know spiritually when we go to confession and restore that right order in our souls, God's grace can then flow in and through us to a maximal degree and can accomplish all kinds of things. So it becomes about making ourselves open and available to receive God's grace and respond to it. The power is His, but the more open we are, the better disposed we are, the more we benefit, and the more He can do in us and through us. And to finish that last session on Wednesday night, Father Justin is going to lead us in prayer, a healing prayer for the whole group at once, rather than individual prayer teams or something like that. We're going to do this wholesale, and having talked about that flow of grace, then we're going to open ourselves up to receive it. And I'm really, really looking forward to that. So tonight, we start with St. Thomas Aquinas. And he was a Dominican priest who lived in the 13th century. And among other things, he wrote the Summa Theologica, the sum of all theological knowledge at that time. In fact, he never finished it, because at some point he had a mystical experience that he came out of, having experienced God so vividly that compared to him, St. Thomas looked at everything he had ever written and realized he said it was straw, and he never wrote again. He never finished the Summa. But even in its unfinished state, he accomplished something pretty incredible, and the Summa is still a incredibly valuable resource that's still very, very used today in the church. But it is not the kind of book you can just pick up and sit down and read. At least I can't. It's very, very philosophical. And nobody studies philosophy anymore. At least I didn't. Yes, there are exceptions, but you have to go out of your way to learn philosophy anymore. It's not considered essential knowledge in our world. There's no philosophy section on the SAT. So my background is in science and medicine, and not even remotely in philosophy. So it took me a really, really long time to get my head around what St. Thomas says. But as I have done so, as I've come to understand these things, it has been life-changing, so much so that I feel really compelled to try to share it with as many other people as I can. And I do that at work, I do that with my friends, I do that in my parish, to the degree that you can talk about those things just generally. But more and more I'm doing retreat talks like this, because it's a wonderful opportunity to share this information with people who are really eager and interested and open to receiving it. And then you can share it, with your friends. So I have tried really hard to come up with a simplified, accessible, explainable way to understand what St. Thomas said about psychology. That's what I'm going to share with you tonight, because even that very simplified understanding is incredibly profound and helpful, especially in the world today where objective truth is no longer recognized as such, and we're all told, that we can identify as whatever we want. I want to start by stating something really obvious, which is that if something's broken, the best way to fix it involves understanding what went wrong. It's generally best to figure out what the actual problem is, because most of the time that will point you to the solution. And speaking as a psychiatrist, so I've been trained both in medicine, general medicine, and then specifically in mental health, I can say that modern medicine does an okay job of this most of the time, but when we get into mental health, it's kind of a disaster. So in our medical training, doctors learn all about anatomy and physiology. We learn all the way about all about the ways the body is supposed to work when it's healthy, the way it was designed to function, and that prepares us to be able to heal it. But in mental health, it's not like that. Our psychology, to the modern sensibility, is kind of a black box. Nobody really knows how it works and is supposed to work, but there's all kinds of theories out there. And some of them are more helpful than others. But as some of you may know, in mental health, when we diagnose conditions, we do it with something called the DSM-5, which stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals. And all it is a list, a bunch of lists of diagnostic criteria, much of which is very subjective. For example, to diagnose depression, there are 9 symptoms. There's a list of 9 symptoms. And if you judge a person to have 5 of those 9 more days than not over a 2-week period with a couple of other criteria that need to be met, then that will qualify them for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Now, those 9 symptoms were picked out by a committee. And most of these things, there's no objective test for. They're things like low mood or low energy. Well, how low does it need to be? And nowhere in that whole process of deciding what it is that we're calling depression is there any information that comes forth about what actually is wrong or any guidance about how to fix it. We're just describing what it looks like from the outside. It's akin to defining a car by saying it has 4 wheels, doors, and windows, and it goes from place to place on a road. But if it stops going, we need to know a little more about what's going on inside. We need to know about spark plugs and alternators and fuel tanks and exhaust systems. And if we think it maybe ran out of fuel, we need to know what kind of fuel it takes. Because if we assume a diesel engine runs on gasoline, that's going to do some serious damage if we put the wrong kind of fuel in there. So St. Thomas is very precise in how he defines things, including mental health and mental illness. Now, I'm paraphrasing heavily, but according to St. Thomas, actually not that heavily, mental health is when your intellect functions the way it's supposed to, the way it was designed to. And mental illness is when it doesn't, when something prevents it. And he tells us exactly how our intellect was designed to function. That's the key. He explains it in a way that was just as true 800 years ago as it is today. And that's what I hope to try to explain to you tonight. So, when Father Justin gets here with the handouts, you'll be able to see this for yourself. But right now, I'm going to describe for you the first one of these schematics, which was my entry point into this material. And if you leave here tonight understanding nothing beyond this entry-level schematic, this will be a win. In terms of Thomistic psychology, this diagram, and it's basically a diagonal line, okay? It's a line with some words on it. This is the equivalent of one of the science posters that you might have had in your kindergarten classroom, like the one that explains the solar system, and there's these brightly colored balls in a circle around the sun, right? And all the planets are about the same size. So it expresses things that are true. There's a bunch of planets in the solar system, and they all rotate around the sun, and these are the names. And so maybe some are closer to the sun and some are farther away. And all these things are true, but also not fully accurate. So if you are going to go further in studying the solar system, if you're going to be an astronaut, you're going to find out pretty quick that orbits aren't really circles, and the planets are not even close to being the same size. So to go any further and make any kind of real practical use of it, you've got to get a little more detailed understanding of the solar system. So here too, after a certain point, that straight diagonal line diagram no longer works, but it definitely does help introduce these concepts. So we'll start with this. So the first thing that diagonal line illustrates is that the faculties of our body-soul composite have an order to them. They exist in a hierarchy. Some are higher, some are lower. Our God is a God of order. He brings cosmos out of chaos. And we instinctively know this about God, don't we? Where God is involved, there's order. It's interesting how that concept makes sense to people even when they don't have an explicit religious faith. I actually talk about these things with some of my non-Catholic and even non-Christian patients, and they get it to a degree. Order just instinctively makes sense to us because we were all created by God. So in this diagram, in this diagonal, so I want you to imagine a diagonal line, and at the top it says intellect and will. The intellect and the will are our highest faculties. And as Catholics, we know that these are where we most closely reflect the image and likeness of God, and it is here that we seek union with Him. We form our intellect in the truth, in an understanding of what is good as God defines good, and then by conforming our will to His will. Then in descending order from there, in the middle, there's memory and emotion, and then appetite and instinct at the bottom. And in a sense, this diagram orders things in kind of an evolutionary, Darwinian sort of way, like you've got the lower life form stuff down at the bottom, and higher life forms toward the top. Down where it says appetites and instincts, I like to call this the lizard brain. These are our more primitive cognitive structures. The only good that you can recognize down there in instinct is self-preservation. That's the only good that exists. Then one step up from that, where it says appetites, the good at that level is basically self-gratification. And then step up from there to where the memory and emotion are listed. There's where you get into things that are more common to higher life forms, so above a lizard, with more sophisticated desires and mechanisms for self-protection, things that include emotions and memories. So your dog and your cat would be up in here. But in fact, these things, these faculties, these middle faculties of memory and emotion, these are the things that can trick us into believing we're being rational, when really we're still operating out of a very primal me-first mentality. Does that make sense? When our emotions are really strong and out of control, they will convince us to do things that in a calmer, more rational state of mind we would not think were a good idea. We're going to be coming back to that a lot. So there is a proper order to these things: intellect, will, memory, emotion, appetite, instinct. And on this diagram that you will get shortly, there are captions under these that, at least with the higher and the middle faculties, that will show us what the goal is, what we need to be striving for as Catholics. Our intellect, first of all, needs to be formed in the truth so that the will can then choose the good. So the intellect knows the truth, the will chooses the good, but we have to be able to define good the way God does. Eternal good, as in our salvation, not just the temporal circumstance that we like. And then with memories, we need to purify our memories in light of thanksgiving. In other words, recognizing that God's will always and everywhere is our salvation, so then everything he permits to happen to us has some salvific purpose. It's ordered to that good. So ultimately, we need to be able to reflect back on anything that has happened in our lives and recognize the good, God's good, in that experience, even when it was difficult. And most of us can acknowledge that it was in those difficult seasons of our lives that we grew closer to God. So faith, strengthening our faith, was probably one significant good that came out of those things. Many times I've had people tell me, or I've heard them say that they've come to be grateful for an accident they have, or for a bout with cancer, or other terrible things in their lives, when they realize that that was a turning point for them. And without that experience, the direction that their life would have taken would not have been what they or God would have wanted. So purifying emotions in light of thanksgiving. Then under emotion, it says pain with an arrow to suffering and sorrow. So this is a whole nother talk, but with pain that we can't avoid, we have a choice in our response. And look who just walked in the back. He's going to hand these out. So when we enter into suffering is the point at which we choose how we're going to deal with that pain. Are we going to suffer in a way that hardens our hearts and isolates us from God and other people? Or are we going to choose instead to suffer in a way that opens us up to God and other people in our lives? So there's better ways to suffer, and there's less good ways to suffer. The most perfect form of suffering is what Mary modeled for us throughout her life. And I like to call this sorrow. Mary is known as our sorrowful mother, and her suffering was completely accepted and completely united with her son's, and then offered with his for the salvation of the world. So that's the goal. To learn to purify our suffering, to choose to perfect our response to pain and transform it into sorrow, which then we've united and offered it with Christ's, as Our Lady did. So hopefully you're getting that handout. You're seeing that diagonal line, although it might be getting a little dark in here to read it. So if I see your phone flashlights go off, I will totally understand. So then under those bottom two faculties, they are what they are. And so the goal with those is essentially just to keep them in their place. The point being that our desires and our physical bodies and our very lives are not the most important thing.
Say that again. That is a very good point.
Our desires and our physical bodies and our very lives are not the most important things. They are important, but they're not the most important. And so we want to preserve that right order within our soul, ordering our faculties from the top down, the intellect and will in charge, so that the flesh, the bottom part of the diagram, is at the service of the soul, the top part of the diagram. That's the Catholic way of doing things. That's what God intended. So ordered the way the world would do, you're doing the opposites. You're basically from the bottom up or from the middle down around. And in that case, the soul is hostage to the flesh. The will still chooses the good or what it understands as good, but it's defining good in a very materialistic way, which is defined by those lower faculties. What keeps us, that which allows self-preservation and self-gratification. The highest good is me and what I want, not what God wants. And that causes our faculties to be disordered. So that kindergarten science poster level diagram shows that very clearly. It's very simply laid out. It's easy to explain, even to my secular patients. I leave the God stuff out for them, but still. So another thing that you can do with that diagram, although I didn't do it on that copy you have, is you can draw a line between where it says will and then below that where it says memory. So you can put a line across right there. And basically that's the boundary that illustrates where fallen angels or demons have the ability to affect you directly and where they can't. So below that line, in those middle and lower faculties, the enemy can mess with you, basically. And above that line, the intellect and the will truly are free. They are off limits to spirits other than God. So our free will remains free even when evil spirits are afflicting us, because they can only get to us in those lower, middle and lower faculties. We can also use that diagram to talk about the importance of working on what I call the memory-emotion interface. And that's something we do in therapy, as well as that inner healing work that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. But either way, the goal is to purify the memories in light of Thanksgiving and choose a more perfected response to pain. And when we do this, it settles our emotions down, and pain actually becomes a lot less painful. And that helps restore our faculties to that top-down proper order. Again, things we'll come back to quite a bit tomorrow. So all things considered, this would be a great poster for any kindergarten classroom because there's a number of things you can quickly and easily explain from it. But it's simplified so much that there's a lot that's missing. And just like with that solar system poster, if you actually wanted to, fly to Mars, you'd need a little more information. For one thing, the terms as they're used toward the bottom of that diagram are not, strictly speaking, faculties, the way St. Thomas would define them. And there are several very important things he does talk about as faculties that are nowhere on that diagram. Particularly the imagination and something called the cogitative power. So furthermore, St. Thomas talks about emotion as being the result of the movement of the sensitive appetites when they encounter their object. And don't worry if that flew over your head just now. I will repeat and explain it in a minute, but the point is I can't do it using that diagram. I need something a little more sophisticated. So to set up the next diagram, I want to briefly mention that there is so if that one's kindergarten, there's what I'd consider the graduate school version out there. It's not in your handout. I wouldn't do that to you. But it truly looks like an appliance wiring diagram. the page in the back of your refrigerator or dishwasher manual that shows how the thing runs but is no use at all to the average homeowner. So that diagram comes out of a massive book that is called The Introduction to the Science of Mental Health, written by Father Chad Ripperger. I always think it's funny that he calls it an introduction because it's 4 inches thick. So just like an appliance wiring schematic, it's too much for most of us. There are so many lines, dotted lines and solid lines and arrows, all of that people's eyes just glaze over. But I mention that just to emphasize that there's a tremendous amount of complexity in what St. Thomas had to say about our faculties, how we're wired to work psychologically, and most of this is completely missing from that first diagram that I talked you through. So what I've done, and it's taken me 8 years, that's how bad I am at figuring out philosophical concepts, but it's taken me that long to get to a point where I could understand that graduate school diagram well enough to be able to distill it down to something a little more accessible to the average Catholic, but that was also significantly more accurate than the kindergarten poster. So I ended up making my own diagram, which is the other one you have in your handout with the circles. It's still a little cartoony, and it does have some arrows, but far fewer, trust me, than the graduate school version. So this diagram is still simple enough that it can be used to point out certain things in a quick visual way, but it includes more of those actual faculties by their proper Thomistic names. So let me go through it hopefully quickly. You see the 2 overlapping circles, and these represent the material body on the bottom and the immaterial soul, the upper one. And remember, we're a body-soul composite. Not just a ghost in the machine, but a true composite. Our bodies and our souls are intimately connected and function together. But notice that the higher faculties of intellect and will are only in the soul circle. That's because these 2 faculties are reserved to the soul. Their function actually does not depend on the physical body the way all the other things do. I made the point with the other diagram that the higher faculties are where we can most closely reflect the image and likeness of God by forming our intellect, let there be light, by forming our intellect according to objective truth, understanding the good as God defines it, and then conforming our will to God's will in choosing that good. So this helped me understand why it is that all human life is sacred. Because if you exist as a human being, starting from the moment of your conception, you have those higher faculties, that intellect and that will, which reflect God's image, regardless of what the rest of you looks like, whether it's one cell or a whole body that's disfigured or missing limbs or in a coma. It doesn't matter. All human life is sacred because it was created in the image and likeness of God there at the top, and that's all it takes. And just like the first diagram, there's a hierarchy with this one too. The things listed at the bottom are more prominently material in their activity, and that immaterial component gets more significant as you go north, if that makes sense. But everything in that lower circle has an immaterial as well as a material component. So the material soul is what animates all of us, all parts of our body, even the muscles and the bones and our digestion. But those locomotive and vegetative faculties, the muscles and bones and digestion, really don't have much of an immaterial component. It's just sort of life itself. Our memory and our imagination have much more of an immaterial part going on. So I hope that makes sense. So then that center right side of the diagram is most of what we work with in mental health. And then where, in the other diagram, I had you draw that line across under the will. Here you can see it's just that line would be the top of that lower circle. So all the faculties below that, or in that lower circle, have a material component firmly rooted in our flesh, and so those are the ones that are vulnerable to influence, direct influence by the enemy. It's much easier to see the reason for that on this diagram, because that's our body, and the intellect and will are reserved to the soul. They are protected from the evil spirits. God alone has access to that, to our soul. So back down in the body, I want to explain some of the things that were not on the other diagram at all. I want to start with where it says sensitive appetites. And then there's an arrow that goes to emotion. St. Thomas talks about our sensitive appetites moving when they encounter their object. And that movement is emotion. So think about it, emotion. There's motion in emotion. So if I love chocolate and someone holds out a plate of truffles and it's Lent, I am going to move toward that plate, especially during Lent. Anything we love, when we encounter it, we are moved by it, either internally or externally or both. And emotion is the name for that movement. There's a whole bunch more detail I could get into with that, not going there tonight. But I just wanted to explain that emotion results from the movement of our appetites. So then I want to hop over to where it says external senses. And those were also missing from the other diagram, but these are easy. This is exactly what you think they are. You know, eyes, ears, nose, touch, sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. The external senses we all learned in kindergarten, that's what that means. But now you see there's an arrow to this thing called common sense power. And this is not common sense like you hear the term. St. Thomas explains that the common sense power integrates all the external sense data into one thing. So the example I usually use is of a banana. If you've got a smooth, firm external texture, mostly yellow color, there's a smell of banana peel. If you open it and take a bite, it's going to taste like a banana. There's no sound involved with a banana. But anyway, each of those things is one data point. And the common sense power puts it all together to make a banana in your head, in your imagination. Another way to say this is the common sense power grasps as one thing that which is tasted, touched, heard, seen, smelt. And then it places that image into the imagination. So the imagination is a super important faculty that was totally missing from the other diagram. And one of the main reasons that this is so important, the imagination is so important, is because it's the image in the imagination that directly stimulates the sensitive appetites, that moves the appetites and causes emotion. So let me say that a little different way. It's the image in our imagination that determines how we feel. The way we feel emotionally is most directly caused by a picture in our head. Father Ripperger explained this to me as he says that the imagination is like a TV screen that the rest of us is always watching. Our physical body can even react directly because of what's on that TV screen. The image there can directly trigger our external senses even. It can cause our physical body to move without any other part of us being involved. So I'll give you an example of this. Think about sitting through a really scary movie. That jump scare, the goosebumps, the involuntary scream, all of that happens because the image from the movie screen gets onto our internal TV screen of our imagination, and then everything else happens just directly without going through our higher faculties. Now, I didn't put all of those arrows on my diagram, but you could draw them in if you wanted to. So going back to our banana example, once in the imagination, what starts out as a very concrete, simple, kind of two-dimensional idea of a banana that you've seen and smelled and touched, it will immediately, like fraction of a second, link up with any similar images that have been in your memory bank, so that you very quickly get a more fleshed out, multidimensional image, because it's probably not the first banana you've ever seen. So the image in your imagination is going to connect to all your memories of past experience, and it's that fleshed out image that's going to cause an emotional response. It's going to move your sensitive appetites, good or bad, based on, do I love this or do I not? Some people love bananas, some people really dislike them. So again, see the arrow from the imagination down there to the movement of the appetites, because that's where emotion originates. But then see also that there's an arrow that goes back up, because emotions themselves can affect the image in your imagination. And again, an example for this, if you've gone to see that scary movie and it's late at night and you're coming home and you hear a noise that you don't immediately recognize coming from somewhere in your house, your pre-existing emotion of fear is going to affect the images that show up in your imagination when you hear that noise. Given that same noise happening at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, 10 o'clock a.m., I should say, you'd imagine something completely different. So there's one more thing I want to point out on that very full diagram, but it's kind of saving the best for last, because I think this is really one of the most profound and amazing concepts within Thomistic psychology, because it offers so much to us in terms of understanding how we work psychologically and how to take back control over things that we might not realize we have control over. And that thing is the cogitative power. I know it's kind of a mouthful, but try to get used to it. Say it to yourself a couple of times. You'll sound really smart. It's fun. Cogitative power. Cogitative power. So the way that I like to explain it is that the cogitative power functions as a kind of project manager for the rest of the lower faculties. It's going to take all the data from all the other things in that lower circle, all of that information. And just like the common sense power made a banana out of various pieces of external sense data, the cogitative power makes it all into a whole concept called a phantasm, which is not a word I love, but I don't know what else to call it. So it's not, this is a more complex kind of 4D image, if you will. It's not just an image of a banana, but it also includes your emotions about bananas, your emotions about that specific banana, everything you remember about bananas from your past, as well as what you want now from that banana. So it's fully fleshed out as a concept, not just an image. Is it still green? Is it ripe? Does it have a few too many brown spots for your liking? Is there a bruise on it? Is it going to make everything in your briefcase smell funny if you take it to work? Because remember what would happen to your lunchbox every time you had a banana in your lunch as a kid? All of that goes into the phantasm. And again, I don't love that word, but the phantasm gets sent up then to the intellect, where your intellect thinks about it and reasons through your options and makes a judgment, and then the will can choose to act. So the thing that impresses me about this is that the cogitative power has a lot of power, such that it's almost like a junior brain. A minute ago, I called it a project manager for that lower circle. Just like a project manager in a company, it's got some limited autonomy. It's got an ability to make some choices and some judgments relative to its area of expertise. So in creating the phantasm that it sends up to the intellect, it gets to decide what information it includes and how to package it, like whether to label it urgent or not. But the project manager is not the CEO of the company, right? The CEO is up here in the intellect. And the intellect can reform, can change the image that the cogitative power is sitting with. So the project manager, if the project manager sends his report to the CEO, like, this is a great banana, I want this banana, I'm gonna eat this banana, but the CEO comes back with, look, I don't care how much I like bananas, I've committed to a low-carb diet. Then the project manager needs to be able to override its hunger, its desire for the banana, ignore all the fond associations that it has, memories of bananas, so that the will can act freely and in service to the intellect and leave the banana alone and hold out for the low-carb snack, the string cheese or the hard-boiled egg. But if the project manager is not in the habit of taking orders from upstairs, if it's a little insubordinate, then the phantasm it sends to the intellect can, in essence, flood the intellect with strong emotional sentiments about how hungry you are and how it would be rude to refuse this banana that your coworker is offering you to be nice. And then there also may be, fears that you won't have another chance to eat anything until much later because you forgot your lunch. And, we all know how this works when we're on a diet. So that's the importance, the influence of the cogitative power. It can either be trained to serve us well, to serve our higher faculties, or it can be unleashed and drive us to drink, literally. Now, it can be helpful, and I've listed these on the back of that handout, helpful to recognize similarities and differences between the cogitative power and the intellect. So St. Thomas tells us that they each do three basic things, and I have those listed. The cogitative power can compose and divide, which is a form of judgment. Think compare and contrast. It figures out how it's going to judge something by identifying what it's similar to and what it's different from. Have I seen anything like this before? So it might say, well, that's a banana, and it looks like other bananas I've eaten before that I remember really liking. It's not, there's no brown on it at all. It's fully yellow. There's maybe just a little green at the stem end. And then it'll assess, is this good, harmful, or useful? So it might say, well, that looks like a really good banana. It's at the exact point of ripeness that I like. And my coworker, who I've been wanting to get to know better, has very kindly offered this to me. And the timing couldn't be better because I'm starving. It's been 3 hours since I ate and I forgot my lunch. All systems go. And then the third thing the cogitative power does is to make a report to the intellect. So again, it's the project manager. It's responsible for taking all that lower faculty data and preparing a phantasm, a report that goes to the intellect. And again, with the banana example, cogitative power did its job, and it sends this report upstairs. This is a perfect banana offered by a coworker we're trying to make friends with. We're starving with no good option for lunch. Got that higher faculties, let's do this. And then without even really thinking about it, your hand is already coming out of your pocket to reach for the banana. But now the phantasm is in the intellect, and we need to think. We need to use our higher faculties. And just like the cogitative power, the intellect also does three things. It has the power to apprehend or to know and understand the truth. it has the power to reason, and it has the power to judge. So it knows, it reasons, and it judges. And in judging, the intellect can also compose and divide, compare and contrast, just like the cogitative power. But the judgment of the intellect is superior, just like the parent's judgment is normally superior to that of a child. And just like a young child, the cogitative power doesn't know what it doesn't know. All it can do is think about that particular thing, the thing right there in front of you. It doesn't do big picture. So it's dangerous for it to be in charge, just like it's dangerous to put a child in charge of your household or a project manager in charge of your company. So in the example of the banana, our higher faculties had just finished committing to a low-carb ketogenic diet because we recently found out we're at risk for diabetes and we have family members on dialysis and we just don't want to go there. So intellect says, thank you, cogitative power. I know that looks like about the best banana you've ever seen. The timing could not be better because we forgot to pack our lunch. And yes, we want to be friends with that coworker, but we're going to say no. So the will says, put the hand back in the pocket, not this time. So that would be an example of rightly ordered faculties. The intellect makes a reasoned decision, and the other faculties stay in line. But it's common for things not to go this way. I remember a funny dieting meme that makes the rounds every so often that shows somebody's healthy eating plan. You might have seen this one. It lists breakfast as like scrambled egg whites and half a grapefruit with black coffee. And then lunch is like a kale salad with poached chicken or something like this. But then lunch includes 2 Oreo cookies for dessert. And then by 2:30, you've had a mid-afternoon snack that consists of the rest of the Oreos in the package. And then dinner is a whole pizza and half a gallon of ice cream. So we've all been on diets like that. And what goes on there is the lower faculties essentially have too much power. We've allowed them to have too much power. When we spend too much time cycling around down there and we don't curtail their activity, especially the imagination, it's like throwing gas on the fire of our lower faculties. Again, our sensitive appetites move based on the image on that TV screen of our imagination. So if you're on a diet and you allow yourself to binge watch Cupcake Wars and fantasize about all the yummy treats you're going to have when Lent is over and you've lost all the weight that you need to lose, how's that going to work? The intellect and will can be overwhelmed and really constrained by strong emotion, such that it becomes very hard to do what you intend. And we all know this from experience. Once it's happened one time, the higher faculties quickly lose their habit of being in charge. And again, something we all have experienced. You know, how many times have we committed to a prayer routine or an exercise regimen that gets us up at 5 a.m., let's say? And that goes great for weeks. And you're like, oh man, I set this habit, I've got it. And then you go on vacation and you're off your schedule for like 4 days. And it's like that habit never happened at all. So that's how things fall apart. But how might this work in reverse? How might the cogitative power actually be able to work for us? Well, remember that it does 3 things. It grasps, it associates, and it makes judgments, but it doesn't really maturely reason. It takes emotions and everything else at face value, and it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So there's a property we can exploit, if you want to call it that. When the cogitative power gets a new piece of information, it takes it in, and that will cause a shift in the phantasm. Sometimes one small piece of new information is all it takes. Suddenly, there's a new image there in the imagination, and it associates with different things in the memory, and it completely changes the phantasm. So let's go back to the banana that our coworker offered. Same setup. We're hungry, trying to go low carb, forgot our lunch. This is someone we're hoping to be friends with, and it's an ideal banana. In this case, the emotions as well as our physical hunger from just starting the diet are so overwhelming that our cogitative power sends this over-the-top persuasive phantasm to the intellect, and the intellect thinks about it for a minute and says, well, you know, I think it's important that we ease into this ketogenic diet. So I'm just going to eat bacon and eggs for the rest of the day. One banana's going to be fine. You know, it's just fruit. It's got potassium in it. And so that hand that had already started to come out of your pocket reaches out and you take the banana. But now your external sense of touch notices something strange. And as you grab the banana, it kind of collapses where you put pressure on it, and you hear a squeak. And your memory says, dog toy. So now the cogitative power says, well, that looks great. It's not like other bananas. It appears to be a dog toy, and it would not be good to eat. As far as usefulness goes, it has none except to play practical jokes on coworkers who are on a diet. So the image in the imagination is now completely different, and the emotions shift. So the cogitative power has a very different phantasm to send up to the intellect, which now understands this is not a real banana. Our coworker is messing with us, although that might be a good sign that they like us enough to tease us. So the point here is that that new piece of information can bring the cogitative power to a totally new conclusion, such that it forms a totally new phantasm that makes it much easier to choose to do what we intend. And well-formed higher faculties, a well-formed intellect, can supply that new information, even under the most challenging circumstances. That is a habit that we can build, a habit of keeping our higher faculties engaged, aware, and in control. And when we're talking about forming and maintaining good habits, we're talking about virtue. Rightly ordered faculties look like virtue. And it's also important to understand that in terms of building virtue, building those habits, there is no neutral act. Whenever you choose to act in a way that establishes and preserves that top-down right order, it's that much easier to do it the next time. It still may take effort, but each virtuous act makes the next one easier. So there's an initially steep part of the curve, and then it gets much easier to progress over time. But the reverse is also true, meaning that when you give in to temptation, even once and even just a little bit, it really does make it that much more difficult to resist the next time. I'm not saying anything that we don't already know from experience. There's a great quote that sums this up by C.S. Lewis. He says, "Good and evil both increase at compound interest." And it's so true. So that's the basics of my middle school diagram. And I want to circle back to where we started, talking about how it's important to know what's wrong in order to be able to safely treat it, fix it. In modern mental health, we may have a really hard time defining what mental health is, what mental illness is. All we can do is describe it. They're crazy. But according to St. Thomas, it's very straightforward. St. Thomas says mental health is when the intellect functions as it was designed to, when all of the other faculties permit its proper function. And mental illness is when something's off, something's interfering. And now, having gone through those diagrams, I think you have a better sense of what that actually means. So we're mentally healthy when our intellect does those things, those three things that it's supposed to do. But in mental illness, the intellect is incapable of rational judgment or reasoning properly, such that one acts according to one acts contrary to rational principles. That's how St. Thomas defines mental illness. So say that again. Mental illness is when the intellect is unable to reason and or judge correctly as it should, which then manifests in irrational behavior. Because the intellect is supposed to be rational as it informs the will. If the intellect is irrational, then the behavior is also irrational. Our thoughts become our words and our deeds. So now notice that the focus in the Thomistic perspective is on the higher faculties, the intellect and the will. In St. Thomas's definitions, emotional distress is not mentioned, whereas in modern mental health diagnosis, that's what we're using to make the diagnosis. How does someone feel? It's the majority of those 9 symptoms of depression that the committee picked out. The modern world elevates emotion at least to the same level as intellect and will, and usually prioritizes emotion above those things. And that is at the core of the difference between a Catholic Thomistic approach to mental health and everything else that's done modernly. It's also the key to being able to maintain or implement a Thomistic framework when you're doing any type of healing work, any type of psychotherapy, any type of treatment, any type of theophostic prayer. It comes down to emotion and the place you give it. It's not that emotion is not important. Emotion is actually very important, but is emotion something we trust to lead us on its own? Do we recognize it to be a guiding faculty on par with our intellect and our will? Or is emotion something that we recognize to be not fully rational? And isn't that obvious, that emotion isn't rational? You'd be surprised how not obvious that is to a lot of people. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised. So to summarize all of this, I made a little chart also in your handout to show the key differences between Thomistic psychology and secular modern approaches. So the Thomistic approach understands and utilizes that full body-soul composite. A secular approach prioritizes the flesh. It does not acknowledge the immaterial soul. A Thomistic approach uses an objective definition of truth and the good as God sees it. A secular approach has a subjective definition of truth. It's whatever we decide is true. And good is defined by the individual or by the individual's flesh, basically. A Thomistic approach includes a clear objective definition of mental health versus mental illness, describing that in terms of the function of the intellect. And with a secular approach, you end up with a whole bunch of different theories and vague descriptive definitions with an emphasis placed on emotion. A Thomistic approach looks at healing as a function of the reconciliation of the soul, meaning those higher faculties, with the Creator, with God. And it involves forming the intellect and conforming the will through building virtue. A secular approach considers healing just to mean feeling better. So we're going to take just a couple minute stretch break, get up, use the restroom. There's just a little bit more that I wanted to cover before we end, and also wanted to mention a couple things to set us up for tomorrow night. So let's be back here. My clock says 7:38. Let's say 7:45. Okay, 1 minute warning. I promise I don't have that much more, but
I'm just going to feel a little bit of empty space. I appreciate everybody's patience. I'm sorry that as we were starting, that you didn't have the handouts. We've run into major issues trying to print these. They had problems printing it beforehand. Our power went out. Part of it was this is not everything spiritual, but part of it was, oh yeah, I forgot to, and then I was going to have them printed or check in, and then I had to go print them at the office, and then I only printed some of them because the tray went empty, and it didn't tell me, so I came here, and I'm like, oh, why didn't I have enough? So I went back and started to print more, and yeah, you know, it's I mean, we don't want to yeah, it is a good sign. We don't want to over-spiritualize everything, but sometimes when you're having resistance to things that bring us freedom. Think about this, just this simple message. We're living in a world that says what you feel is objectively true, and you must kill everything that speaks against what you feel. And how many people do we have who are so broken and they're demanding radically dangerous things to their minds and their bodies because of what they feel? And I don't say that to judge them. So even in this, and if your mind's swimming a bit, because you're like, oh my gosh, this is so big, okay? Before we move into this next piece, I just want you to ask the Spirit of wisdom, Holy Spirit of wisdom, to fill your mind with knowledge and to fill your mind with truth. And in the name of Christ, anything that's being stirred up, Christ is speaking truth to that part and with love. Christ is drawing near to you in that place. He already is there. And actually, if we can go into this great Catholic truth, what happens in the midst of this is we start to encounter Jesus in that place we have never encountered him before. It's very much what St. Augustine says. You are within me, Lord, but I did not know you because I was not within myself. Therefore, I did not know you. And in my story of being healed, I had to learn to be in encounter with Christ and myself in that place where the emotions were dominating me. Emotions that were produced because of painful things that happened to me. And so in the midst of this is a beautiful way for us to understand how the human person works and why the human person is so beautiful as created by God. We can start to understand in ourselves, why do I struggle sometimes with the things I struggle with? Because, emotions driving the car. And it's not that emotion's evil, because I want to be speaking that too, because I can just hear it in the back, the enemy sowing his little things. Oh, your feelings are bad. Your feelings are not bad. In the name of Jesus Christ, your feelings are not bad, nor are your emotions evil. Some of them are just really hard to live with, okay? So can we accept that truth in the name of God, that our emotions are neither evil nor objectively bad? Okay. So may the Holy Spirit of wisdom and knowledge abide powerfully within us and upon us. And may Our Lady's seat of wisdom continue to direct our retreat master and us as we continue to pray, learn, respond, and trust. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Father, and thank you all for hanging in here. I know it's like drinking out of a fire hose. So this material is pretty heavy. And to echo what Father said, yeah, emotions are not bad. They're actually extremely good, useful sources of information, and they're part of how God made us. But there's a right order to things. So I wanted to throw out some examples of what you could call, what in medicine we talk about pearls, clinical pearls. You could call these Thomistic pearls that you can take home to reflect on and even share with other people if you feel so moved. One of the best ways to learn something is to teach it to others. And that's actually how I've learned this the best, is to start to give talks about it. And every time I do it, I learn a little bit more. So if you really want to internalize anything and remember it, you should talk about it and try to explain it to someone. So probably my favorite pearl with this stuff is the piece that about the image in the imagination. That's what triggers the emotional response. And this is one of these super concrete things that I can say to someone in my clinical practice. Again, we don't have to bring God into it at all. I can just say, when you suddenly got so upset or afraid or whatever, what was the image in your head? Because that's what's driving how you feel. What can we do to adjust that image? Is there something more accurate we can put there? So, yeah, the image in your imagination is why you feel the way, or the immediate cause of why you feel the way you do. Change the picture in your head. It'll change how you feel. My other favorite little saying, which I joke about wanting to make t-shirts of, is that strong emotions make us stupid. Because they do. I know this for myself. When I am overwrought, I do not make good decisions if I can think at all. The value of explaining this, though, through one of those Thomistic diagrams that I shared is because there is a mechanism behind that. There's a reason why those emotions are, when actually, if I had the skills, I'd love to be able to 3D animate either one of those, where the word emotion could just pull off the page and suck all the other things with it. St. Thomas tells us that a very strong passion, a strong emotion, pulls all the activities of the soul in that direction. So again, you ideally don't want the emotion determining the direction that you're going in, but it will if you aren't careful. And also, the other point about that is, with the strong emotions, is that we can reasonably do a lot of things to help keep our emotional state in check. We can get to bed on time. That's a big one for me. There's always so many things that I want to do right when it's bedtime, But actually going to bed on time so that I can get enough sleep. Actually learn those breathing exercises that everybody says are good for you. They really do work. Learn them and use them. Go to therapy. Go see a counselor if you have something that's really troubling you that you need to process, you need to work out. Or take medication if you're somebody whose biology includes a vulnerability to those conditions that make for strong emotions that really are nobody's fault. That's actually a function of your biology. And when anything happens that really amps us up in frustration or anger, we can choose to do things like go for a run, take some swings at a pillow or a punching bag, or, really get busy with some bubble wrap, something to diffuse that strong emotion before we put ourselves in a position where we're making any decisions or talking to anyone in a way that we could otherwise do something we'd later regret. In other words, just figure out a way to settle yourself down before you make any decisions. It is also very helpful to explain to other people with that line I talked about drawing on that first diagram, or the top of the circle in the second one, about the difference between how the enemy can affect us directly in our flesh, and that there's that line above which spirits other than God can't pass. Because demons can stir our emotions directly as well as indirectly by affecting our memory and our imagination. And again, the image in our imagination causes our appetites to move and causes emotions. So demons will pull images out of our memory and stick them in our imagination in order to manipulate us, to tempt us or frighten us or divide us from other people, and to make us emotionally overwrought and stupid. More than anything, though, they want to separate us from God. They don't want us practicing virtue, and they do not want us to be close to our Lord. Now, all of that points to how important it is to guard ourselves, and especially our children, against pornography. Because once an image is in your memory bank, it can be used against you. You really can't unsee things. You can pray for the grace to forget them, but it's much easier if you can avoid seeing them in the first place. We also need to be aware in general of the importance of forming our intellect in the truth, strengthening our will to choose the good, even in the face of opposition. Remember that good and evil both increase at compound interest, as C.S. Lewis says. So the stronger our higher faculties are, the more well-ordered everything else will be, and the more resistant to emotional upset or temptation or any form of demonic interference we will be. So again, nothing takes away our free will, but the free use of our will can be heavily constrained by strong emotion. Even so, our will still is free, and God himself can and does assist us, even in the midst of those storms, with his grace, because God has access up there, and other spirits do not. I'll also mention that you can understand and help other people understand the detrimental impact of social media using these diagrams. I think it's obvious to all of us that social media has done some harm to our society, even though it's been beneficial in some ways, but especially for the young, it's caused problems and continues to do so. And here's why. Social media trades on that memory, emotion, imagination interface. It kindles and accelerates fires that burn down there in the lower faculties. Because when we're scrolling and clicking and filling our brains with these images and people's comments and likes and the drama, all the rest of it, we're just marinating in a stew of these lower faculties. We end up constantly comparing ourselves to other people, to other things we see. And our focus in doing that is generally not on anything virtuous or helpful. Our focus is on us, on me, and not in a good way. And it all happens so fast and with so much urgency that our project manager kind of forgets his place. And if he does allow any input from the CEO, he doesn't allow any time for any of it to get processed. So it's click, 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 like, subscribe, without any reasoning going on, any higher faculty involvement. So our lower faculties end up getting stronger and louder, and those emotions get louder and louder, and our higher faculties get more and more removed from the action. The final thought I want to leave you with is just a brief example that I sometimes use in my counseling practice. I've actually used it or something like it for a long time before I ever encountered Thomistic psychology. But now I know why it works. Because a new piece of information can totally change the image in the imagination, and with it, the emotional response. So many times I will work with young men or women, and to be honest, this is normally a conversation I have with a young woman in a bad relationship who doesn't want to let it go. She'll tell me, oh, he's such a good person, it's just this one thing, but I know he can change. And often the just one thing is actually a really big deal. Like, oh, he doesn't drive. Well, it turns out he lost his driver's license because he had one too many DUIs. Or he's between jobs right now. But actually, that's been a chronic problem, and there's always a good reason. It's always someone else's fault, or it's just bad luck. You know, he's had such a string of bad luck. So when something comes up like this, I might, and it's obvious to me that this young woman is blind to the obvious, I might talk to her about a pan of brownies. And I didn't come up with this. It appears to be one of those internet lore things at this point. Otherwise, I'd give credit where it's due. But I tell her, imagine I'm offering you a pan of brownies, and they look and smell just like any other brownies, you know, warm, they look all fudgy, they got the crackly top, and you are definitely gonna take me up on that. But then I tell you that when I made them, I stirred a tablespoon of dog poop into the batter. You would never know it. You're not gonna taste it. But now that you do know it's in there, are you gonna have one? And this ends up being a very powerful argument because it makes the point that if there's something very, very bad mixed in with a lot of other things that are very good, that bad thing doesn't cease being bad. Maybe there isn't a lot of it, but it's still there, and it needs to be considered along with everything else. What we're going for here is like with the banana that turned out to be a dog toy, a shift in the phantasm at the level of the cogitative power. Because the minute I say dog poop, something fires off in everybody's memory. We all know what that smells like. And this instantly alters the image of the brownies that was in your imagination. And that's what happens when someone is young, or maybe not so young, and they get wrapped up in an unwise relationship, and their emotions are stronger than the intellect and will. The weight that will be given to that data point about the DUIs or the job problems or whatever is really low. It's far too low. It's like emotions are putting an arm up, like nothing to see here. So I'm trying to equip a young woman in that situation to recognize with her intellect that these are serious red flags, and to choose with her will to send that information down loud and clear to the cogitative power, which will equip that project manager to quiet the emotions for a moment and really look behind that arm, really take a good look at what's there. Now we have new information and can construct a new image, so the emotions are going to shift in response. The phantasm is different, and then rational judgment can proceed unimpeded, or so we hope. So that is the end of what I have prepared for tonight. I want to assure you that tomorrow night is much kinder and gentler information. We're going to be talking about inner healing. And I mean, it's really the same truth. That's the thing. It's really the same truth, but it's maybe more from the perspective of theophostic prayer or what Dr. Bob Schutz and the John Paul II Healing Center does. If they get delivered tonight or tomorrow, I had ordered some little prayer booklets that Bob Schutz just made available. They're $9 a piece on his website. He gave me a volume discount for the ones that I brought, that I ordered to be sent here. So I can sell them for $7 cash or $7.50 credit or debit. So if you would like one of those, please say a prayer that they get delivered in time for me to bring them tomorrow. But it is a wonderful, small little collection of prayers, and I'm going to be talking about the prayers in there and how to use them in our own inner healing work tomorrow. So again, come prepared if you want one of those booklets, $7 cash or check or $7.50 with a card.